Hello, everybody. Welcome to our newest edition of the International Macrohistory online seminar series. And we're delighted to open the season with a presentation by Professor Oded Galor from Brown, who's going to talk to us about his, give a preview basically, of his new book, The Journey of Humanity, a book which will be published by Penguin and Random House publications and will appear in the end of March with 28, so I've been told 28 translations at the same time. So without further ado, because I know Oded has a lot to say, so we'll start. I'll just remind you the rules of engagement. So basically we go on for 45 minutes and you can write your questions in the Q&A. In the Q&A box, don't put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A, and after 45 minutes, we'll open up the floor for the Q&A, and we formally end at the hour, 6 p.m. Geneva time, and we have another 15 minutes of less formal discussion with Oded. So without further ado, Oded, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. So the journey of humanity explores the evolution of societies since the emergence of Homo sapiens nearly 300,000 years ago in Africa. It focuses on two of the most fundamental mysteries in the context of the human journey. The mystery of growth, namely, what are the roots of the dramatic transformation in living standards in the past 2 centuries, after hundreds of thousands of years of stagnation, and the mystery of inequality, namely, what is the origin of the vast inequality in the wealth of nations. Well, over most of human existence, human life was nasty, brutish, and short. It was remarkably similar to that of any other species on planet Earth. Humans were preoccupied by survival and reproduction. Living standards fluctuated near subsistence, and there were minor differences in living standards across time and across space. In fact, a few centuries ago, 1/4 of newborns died before reaching their first birthday. Numerous women perished during childbirth. Life expectancy fluctuated in a narrow range of 25 to 40. And most people rarely departed from their remote birthplace. They live in darkness after the disappearance of the sun over the horizon, and they were largely illiterate. And perhaps more strikingly, economic crisis during this period did not lead to belt tightening, it led to mass starvation and extinction. So during this period, the quality of life of an English farmer in the 16th century was very similar to the quality of life of a Chinese serf in the 14th century, a Mayan peasant in the 5th century, a Greek herder in the 4th century BC, an Egyptian farmer 5,000 years ago, and even a shepherd in Jericho 11,000 years ago. And then, over the past 2 centuries, the world is experiencing this major metamorphosis, dramatic transformation in living standards within and across societies. Income per capita in the world increases 14-fold, life expectancy has more than doubled, and there is a great divergence in income per capita across countries and regions of the world. To illustrate this transformation, consider residents of Jerusalem that are whisked in a time machine from Roman Jerusalem at the time of Jesus to Ottoman Jerusalem in the 19th century. Despite this 2,000-year jump, individuals will be able to adjust instantaneously to the new environment. Past knowledge would be largely applicable. Technological improvements would be merely incremental and will allow adaptation. Occupation would require very similar skills, and life expectancy would remain largely unchanged and would not require an adjustment in the mindset of individuals. But consider these individuals again if we whisk them yet again in a time machine 200 years forward, from Jerusalem of the 19th century to Jerusalem of today. This would be a shocking experience. In fact, past knowledge would be largely obsolete. Technologies would appear as witchcraft. Occupations would require incomprehensible skills, and life expectancy would double and would require future-oriented mindset. Education decisions, saving decisions, life cycle decisions. So in fact, in contrast to some conventional wisdom, living standard had not increased gradually in the course of human history. Yes, technological progress has been gradual and accelerated over time, but it had negligible impact on living standards in the long run over most of human history. And the recent rise in living standard reflects what I will define as a phased transition, namely an abrupt transformation once a tipping point had been reached. So if we review the evolution of income per capita in the past 2,000 years, we witness a striking phenomenon. Income per capita is relatively stable, fluctuating around a constant level for a long period of time, and then we see a major eruption in the past few centuries. In fact, if I would delete the labeling of the axis, this would appear like an output of a seismograph that is detecting tectonic activities, calm that is ultimately resulting in a major eruption. This is the evolution of income per capita across the globe. This is the metamorphosis that humanity experienced in the past few centuries. But in addition, this metamorphosis is not occurring at the same time period across the globe. Some societies are experiencing this change a few centuries ago, others towards the end of the 20th century. And since this transformation is associated with 14-fold increase in income per capita, it implies that a huge divergence is emerging in the world economy. Now, if we think about the resolution of these two mysteries, the mystery of growth and the mystery of inequality, naturally, we have to notice that much of the inequality in the world today was originated due to this differential timing of the transition from stagnation to growth. And therefore, the resolution of these mysteries would require the identification of the forces that permitted the transition from stagnation to growth, the identification of the origins of the differential timing of the transition across the globe, and the understanding of the role of historical and prehistorical forces in this differential timing. Forces that emerged hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and even tens of thousands of years ago. And naturally, the resolution of these mysteries will provide us with important insights about the hurdles that are faced by less developed societies in their transition from stagnation to growth, and the design of strategies to mitigate inequality across the globe. If you think about the process of development as a whole, one can segment the process of development into three fundamental phases: the Malthusian epoch, the post-Malthusian regime, and the modern growth regime. The Malthusian epoch emerges at a time where an atomically modern human emerges in Africa 300,000 years ago, and it spends nearly 99% of human existence. This is a period that is characterized by interesting dualism, stagnation in income per capita, along with dynamism in technology, population, and adaptation. And then, towards the end of the 18th century, we see that in the most advanced societies of the world, there is an escape from these Malthusian forces into the post-Malthusian regime. We see the emergence of economic growth in income per capita, along with a dramatic spike in population growth. But what allows this post-Malthusian regime to be sustained is, in fact, the onset of the demographic transition that reduces the counterbalancing effect of population on income per capita, and the world is sailing into the modern growth regime. Now, it is critical to understand the forces that are operating in the Malthusian epoch, because these are the forces that ultimately permitted humanity to escape from the arms of the Malthusian octopus. And the Malthusian epoch is characterized by important dualism: stagnation on the one hand and dynamism on the other hand. There is stagnation in living standards, income per capita fluctuate near subsistence, life expectancy fluctuated in a narrow range of 25 to 40 years. But at the same time, there is great dynamism. Dynamism in technology, dynamism in population, and dynamism in adaptation. Technological progress initially is very slow, and population growth is very slow. But over 300,000 year period, this slow change is generating an enormous change. We're moving from Stone Age, stone tool technologies into the steam engine. We're moving from a population that is relatively small in the eve of the agricultural revolution to a huge population in the eve of industrialization. 400-fold increase in the world population from the agricultural revolution to the industrial revolution. And in addition, as I said, humans are adapting to their environment. And these three forces are generating Malthusian dynamism that ultimately triggers the transition from stagnation to growth and permits humanity to escape from the arms of the Malthusian octopus. Now, it is important to understand the three fundamental forces that are operating in the Malthusian epoch. The first one is, in fact, the impact of technology on population and income per capita. So during the Malthusian epoch, when technology is advancing, not surprisingly, resources and income per capita increases in the short run. But this is not a long-lasting phenomenon. And the reason is that population starts to grow, mortality declines, fertility decreases, and as a result of it, as long as income is above subsistence, population is growing and ultimately bringing down income per capita to the original equilibrium position. And consequently, technologically advanced societies or land-rich economies had larger population, but very similar levels of income per capita, striking implications. And evidence very much support these ideas. Look at land productivity and population density in 1500, places that were more fertile had higher population density. This is not a surprise, and this is in fact not a confirmation of the Malthusian hypothesis. But importantly, over the same time period, land productivity is not resulting in higher income per capita in the long run. And similarly, if we focus on technology, technological advancement is resulting in higher population density, but not richer population. So very different from what we see in today's world. Technologically advanced societies have more people, but not richer people. The second important element is the process of adaptation. The Malthusian pressure, as we just said, is affecting the size of the population, but at the same time, it affects the composition of the population. So traits that are complementary to the growth process naturally generate higher income, tautologically. And as a result of it, in a Malthusian epoch, higher reproductive success. And consequently, they become more and more prevalent in society. Furthermore, a process of imitation is taking place. These traits are being imitated, and this horizontal transmission is increasing the prevalence of this trait in the population. And consequently, this evolutionary process raised the prevalence of complementary traits to the growth process, reinforces the process, and the ultimate takeoff from stagnation to growth. And the third component that is important to note is that naturally technology is not manna from heaven. Technological progress is fostered by the size of the population and the composition of the population. It is affected by the supply of innovations, the demand for innovations, the diffusion of knowledge, and the division of labor. So the scale of the population and the composition of the population foster technological progress due to these five elements. And consequently, as we move forward, during the Malthusian epoch, we see this reinforcing interaction. Population size and the composition of the population is affecting technological progress. And in turn, technological progress is governing the size of the population and the composition of the population. And this reinforcing interaction in the course of human history, initially very slow, but ultimately intensifying, is ultimately accelerating technological progress to a point in which technological progress outpaced biological reproduction. And consequently, we start to see the growth in income per capita more pronouncedly, and we start to see this dramatic increase in population growth. Now, importantly, these wheels of change are rotating in the course of human history. And in the Malthusian epoch, they intensify, as I said, the size of the population, the composition of the population contributes to further technological progress. Further technological progress affects, in turn, the size and the composition of the population. And over time, technological progress accelerates, and ultimately it reaches a critical threshold, a phase transition. And once this critical threshold is reached, human capital becomes essential in the ability of individuals to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment. And as a result of it, human capital formation trigger a reduction in fertility. Individuals are faced by limited resources, and naturally, if they invest more in human capital, they have to economize in other aspects, and this is the size of the family. And the reduction in fertility is basically removing the counterbalancing effect of population on the growth process. The Malthusian equilibrium vanishes, and as a result of it, the holy triangle, technological progress, human capital formation, and the decline in population growth are causing the world to sail into the sustained growth regime. So what we see in the course of human history is the operation of the wheels of change below the surface. Population increases, population composition is such that there is adaptation, and technological progress becomes faster and faster and faster. And we reach a point in which the rotation of these wheels is such that in order to cope with the rapidly changing technological environment, people must invest in human capital. We see mass education as opposed to selected education, an onset of the demographic transition, and a transition to the modern growth regime. So much like the transition from liquid to gas in nature, as we heat water and as water reaches a critical threshold of 100 degrees Celsius, in nature, we see the transition from the Malthusian epoch into the modern growth regime. Something is percolating below the surface. And this is the rate of technological progress that feeds back into the latent return to human capital. Ultimately, the return to human capital starts to justify mass investments in education. It triggers the onset of the demographic transition, freeing the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population and permitting the world to sail into a new regime in which the growth of income per capita is stable at around 2% in the past 150 years across the most developed societies in the world. Now, thus far, it appears that the journey of humanity is perhaps unstoppable. think about shattering and dreadful events in the course of human history, and in particular World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, the Spanish flu, and most recently COVID-19, they had devastating effect on humanity in the short run. But nevertheless, they had limited impact on the grand arc of human development. Living standard had swiftly recovered from all these catastrophes. But the question is whether climate change that is looming in the horizon will be, in fact, a single historical event that will derail humanity from its journey. We know that the Industrial Revolution triggered the alarming impact on the environment. But will the impact of global warming be short-lived, or will it have the most catastrophic and long-lasting consequences of all? And in fact, the book is offering a hopeful outlook. It suggests that the tipping point that the world has recently reached, namely the persistent decline in fertility rate, human capital formation, and the incredible power of innovations, as we saw in the context of immunization and vaccination in the context of the current pandemic. These forces will provide humanity with the time for the advancement of revolutionary technologies that would turn this climate crisis into a fading memory. Namely, the decline in fertility will reduce temporarily the pressure on the environment and will buy scientists the necessary time for the development of these revolutionary technologies that will turn, as I said, this climate crisis in the coming decades and century into a fading memory. Critical for this is precisely the impact of industrialization, the decline in fertility, and the increase in the power of innovations. But as I said earlier, when we think about the journey of humanity, it is very important to note that the journey is not universal across the globe. Some societies are experiencing a much more rapid growth process in the past 2 centuries. And as a result, with a huge divergences occurring across the globe. And the question is, what are the roots of this inequality? So naturally, we realize that in order to understand this inequality, we have to step at least 200 years back to the timing of this transition from stagnation to growth. But in fact, this will not be sufficient because the hurdles that are faced by less developed societies at this point in time in transitioning to sustained economic growth is predicated on certain events that are occurring earlier. And this will require us to look further back in human history. If we focus simply on the proximate causes of development, cross-country variations in physical capital, human capital, and technological level, this will not take us very far because, as I said, much of the variations in income per capita across the globe originated in the past 2 centuries, 200 years ago. And the question would be why some countries fail to efficiently invest in physical and human capital, why some country fails to adopt advanced technologies. And this, as I said, will take us into the realization that in order to generate more equality across the globe, we need to think about deep-rooted factors in the context of comparative development. Deeper roots, such as institutional and cultural characteristics, and the ultimate roots, geographical characteristics, and societal characteristics that were determined as early as the time of the exodus of anatomically modern humans from Africa 60 to 90,000 years ago. So when we think initially about the role of institutions, many argued that the emergence of these differential institutions across the globe are behind comparative development today. And the idea was that growth-enhancing, inclusive institutions were adopted in some societies, growth-retarding, extractive institutions were adopted in others, and consequently, a divergence occurred across the globe. But it is important to realize that institutions are rarely manna from heaven. Yes, there are instances in which institutions emerge at random critical juncture. Certainly, think about the division of Korea along the 38th parallel. This is a critical juncture that affected dramatically North and South Korea. We can think about the impact of the Black Death on the decline of feudalism and the ultimate emergence of the Industrial Revolution in England. And we can consider the Glorious Revolution and its impact on industrialization in England. Certainly, we can think about a counterfactual history in which William of Orange would be defeated by James II, the Glorious Revolution would not take place, and England will not experience the Industrial Revolution first. So critical junctures are important, but they're not central. Institutions have mostly evolved gradually in the course of human history, and they reflect the habitat of humans in the course of human history. When people move into agriculture in the course of the Neolithic Revolution, this affected population density, and actually population density increased the demand for institutions that will allow cooperation and functioning of society. Fertile land, again, increased population density and increased the demand for rule of law so as to facilitate the interaction across farms. Suitable land for large plantation generated extractive institutions and slavery, and the disease environment affected the evolution of societies and ultimately the emergence of centralized institutions. So it appears that institutions, in fact, evolve in conjunction with the more primitive conditions, geographical conditions, and human characteristics. Culture. If you think about the impact of culture, naturally, again, we can think about the emergence of differential cultural traits across regions. Growth-enhancing traits such as social capital, or growth-retarding traits such as family ties. And in fact, it was argued that this type of traits can explain the current divide between the northern part of Italy and the southern. But again, cultural traits are not manna from heaven. Yes, there are a few instances in which what can be defined as cultural mutations made a huge impact. If we think about Judaism, mandatory literacy in the 1st century BCE led into human capital formation for a prolonged period of time, and ultimately great economic benefit as societies became more human capital intensive. Or if you think about Protestantism, naturally the emphasis on thrift and entrepreneurship ultimately made a great difference in terms of economic prosperity. But in most cases, culture evolved and adapted to the environment in which people operate. In fact, the return to human capital affected the predisposition of individuals towards child quality and education. The return to agricultural yield affected the ability of individuals to delay gratification and consequently future-oriented mindset. Climatic volatility affected the degree of loss neutrality and consequently entrepreneurship, and plow suitability affected the adoption of the plow and consequently the emergence of gender norms as we see them today. So this takes us back into the shadow of geography. And geography has a direct effect and an indirect effect. So when you think about geographical characteristics, such as soil quality, the disease environment, or isolation, naturally, they have a direct impact on labor productivity and human capital formation, and technological adoption as well. But in addition, and importantly, they have an indirect impact on the evolution of cultural and institutional characteristics, as we just described. Namely, institutions and culture are not manna from heaven. To a large extent, they're affected by important processes that are occurring in the course of human history. In addition, in the context of the shadow of geography, at a certain point, societies are moving into the Neolithic revolution, into the agricultural revolution. And this has a tremendous effect on the process of development, not as many think till today, but in fact, till about the year 1500. So if we think about the legacy of the agricultural revolution, a theory that proposed by Jared Diamond, and naturally, the transition of hunter-gatherer tribes to agricultural communities led to the emergence of a non-food producing class. It was associated with knowledge creation in the form of science, technology, and written languages. And ultimately, this development led into a technological head start that persisted over time. And according to Diamond, variations in the timing of the Neolithic revolution across the globe are behind the variation in economic prosperity across the globe. So naturally, there are great variations in the time of the Neolithic revolution across the globe. In Fertile Crescent, the Neolithic revolution occurs as early as 12,000 years ago. In China, around 10,000 years ago. In Mesoamerica, 9,000 years ago. But some regions of the world are experiencing them only very recently. And consequently, according to the Diamond hypothesis, the prosperity of Eurasia in the pre-colonial era reflects biodiversity that led into larger number of domesticable species of plants and animals, and east-west orientation that permitted the diffusion of agricultural practices along very similar latitudes. And consequently, early Neolithic revolution in Eurasia led into the persistence of technological head start via urbanization, the formation of city-states, nation-states, empires, etc., and ultimately led, according to Diamond, to the domination in the colonial era. Now, in fact, what we see in the evidence is that the effect of the Diamond hypothesis is tremendous, still about the year 1500, but it has very little explanatory power when we focus on today's inequality. Today's inequality, for reasons that you can read in my book, is in fact largely orthogonal to the timing of the Neolithic revolution. And as we peel layers of influence in understanding inequality across the globe, we are reverting ultimately not only 12,000 years ago to the Okay, so back to where we were. So as I said, if you think about the Diamond hypothesis, the Diamond hypothesis is taking us back to 12,000 years ago, to the onset of the Neolithic revolution, suggesting that the variations in income per capita across the globe can be traced to this event. But in fact, there is an early event, which is the out of Africa migration of Homo sapiens that is affecting comparative development across the globe. So as you know, Homo sapiens is departing from Africa in large numbers as early as 60 to 90,000 years ago. And this migration is affecting the distribution of population diversity across regions and comparative economic development. And the reason is the following. The main building blocks behind this hypothesis is first the serial founder effect, namely that there is lower level of diversity among indigenous population at greater migratory distance from Africa. And the second one is the existence of an intermediate level of diversity that is conducive to productivity. And this intermediate level is balancing between the adverse effect of diversity on social cohesiveness and the beneficial effect of diversity on creativity and innovations. So as people are moving out of Africa, departing population is carrying only a subset of the cultural, phenotypic, genetic, behavioral, linguistic diversity that exists in their parental colonies. Migration is sequential, and as a result of it, low level of diversity exists among indigenous populations at greater migratory distance from Africa. So if we start somewhere in Africa with a certain level of diversity, cultural if you wish, Then, as population are drifting from Africa into other locations, they carry with them only a subset of the diversity that existed initially. This is simply based on sampling from a limited distribution, and the level of diversity is declining as they move further and further into planet Earth. And consequently, if you look at the relationship between an index of diversity and migratory distance from Africa, we see this striking negative relationship between the two. The further we are from Africa, the less diverse societies are. And this is true in the context of phenotypic diversity, structure of bones. It is true in the context of phonemic diversity, structure of sounds. Now, naturally, when you think about the trade-off that is associated with diversity, as I said, there exists a level of diversity that maximizes productivity, that one that balances between the adverse effect of diversity on social cohesiveness and the beneficial effect of diversity for creativity and innovations. So on the adverse side, diversity enhances mistrust, disagreement about the desirable public goods, and increases ethnic fractionalization. And all these forces are contributing to interpersonal and ethnic conflicts, into social non-cohesiveness, and as a result of it, inefficient operation relative to the production possibility frontier. And consequently, we see this cost of diversity across the globe. Trust is lower in more diverse societies. Diversity in political preferences is larger across diverse societies. Ethnic fractionalization is larger across diverse societies, and civil conflict is larger across diverse societies, whether we focus on countries or ethnic groups. And the benefit side, population diversity increases cross-fertilization and complementarities in the production process. It increases the upper tail of the ability distribution that matters for innovations. And as a result of it, diversity fosters innovations and expands the production possibility frontier. And we see it quite clearly in the context of the relationship between scientific papers per person and diversity, accounting for many other factors. And consequently, if in fact the effect of diversity is positive and diminishing in the context of innovations, and the effect of homogeneity on social cohesiveness is positive and diminishing, it implies that there is a hump-shaped relationship between diversity and development. And what we can see here is that, in fact, the theory would suggest that there would be an optimal level of diversity. And this optimum will shift in the course of development as technology becomes more and more demanding. Societies that are more diverse will have the upper hand. And in fact, this is what we see in the course of human history. There is a hump-shaped relationship between diversity and population density. There is a hump-shaped relationship between diversity and urbanization. There is a hump-shaped relationship between diversity and income per capita today. And in fact, if you look at the optimal level of diversity in, say, the year 2000, if countries like Bolivia, which is the most homogeneous country in the sample, would have the growth enhancing level of diversity, their income per capita, accounting for anything else, will increase by a factor of 5. And if you take the most homogeneous country in the sample, namely Ethiopia, and you decrease the level of diversity of Ethiopia to the growth enhancing one, income per capita in Ethiopia will nearly double. And this is true not only across countries. If you look at ethnic groups, all the ethnic groups in the ethnographic atlas, and you look at measure of productivity in the past, which is population density, you see this hump-shaped relationship in the year 10,000, in the year 5,000, in the year 1,000, in the year 1,500, etc. In fact, in any year in which we have observation about population density. So what we see in the course of human history is that the wheels of change, population size, population composition, and technological progress is evolving gradually. And ultimately, it keeps pace. But in fact, this evolution is not independent of institutional and cultural characteristics that are naturally affecting property rights, and as a result of it, technological progress, affecting fertility decision, and as a result of it, the size of the population, affecting cultural traits, and as a result of it, the composition of the population, etc. But in addition, there are basically the initial conditions, geographical one and migratory distance from Africa, that are interacting and are ultimately bringing about the transition from stagnation to growth and the divergence in this emergence across the globe. So in fact, if you look at the roots of comparative development, it is quite apparent that deep-rooted factors explain nearly 90% of the variations in income per capita today. And if you look at the different channels that I just explored, the dispersal of humans from Africa, nearly 60,000 years ago, in fact, 70 to 26% of the unexplained variation in income per capita today. The Neolithic and time-till settlement, negligible fraction. Climatic factors, very important, about quarter to 2/5 of the variation. The disease ecology, 9 to 14%. Cultural factors, about 20%. And political institutions in the form of constraint on the executive and the polity for around 3 to 9%. So as one would expect, all variables that I just described are very important in understanding comparative development. Geography, the out of Africa hypothesis, political institutions, culture, etc. And you can see the relative magnitudes of the two. They can vary naturally, but what you can see is that all factors are very important, but it's very important to think about the deep-rooted factors of development. So does it mean that the grip of the past is long-lasting? Well, if you think about the impact of institutions, we see that in recent decades, and we should expect in the coming decades too, that developing countries are adopting gradually growth-enhancing institutions. In the context of culture, we should expect the impact of culture to diminish over time due to the fact that developing countries are emulating growth-enhancing cultural norms. And we can see the adverse effect of geography, context of the disease prevalence, lack of access to the sea, etc., that is being mitigated by the diffusion of medical, transportation, and IT technologies. But one element that remains relatively intact is basically differences in human diversity. So there is modest convergence in human diversity across the globe, but attachment of individuals to their homelands and native cultures, and of course, legal barriers to international migration prevents the convergence of human diversity across the globe. Now, does it imply, the fact that I show that deep-rooted factors are so important, does it imply historical determinism? Not at all. On the contrary, the insights of the journey of humanity permits us to design growth-enhancing, country-specific, history-specific policies that could mitigate inequality across the globe. For instance, education policies that are geared towards social cohesiveness and tolerance in diverse societies, and pluralism in homogeneous ones, or policies that foster growth-enhancing cultural traits, such as future-oriented mindset, gender equality, and again, tolerance and respect for difference. And naturally, these elements are key to the prosperity of the human species as a whole in the decades and in the centuries to come. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Oded, for a fascinating and, if I might say, a very optimistic view of the past and mostly the future, which I think, as an economist, as a policymaker, as an historian, I really appreciate that there's a positive outlook and we're not predetermined by history. So, and also thank you for adjusting yourself after the technical glitch, but so we will shorten the Q&A, the formal Q&A because of that, but that was kind of a random thing, a random event a random disaster according to your theory. But may I ask you, first of all, sort of, I mean, it's a broad-minded type of analysis. So let me ask you a couple of broad-minded questions, and not so much about the specifics. So how do you actually interact, or sort of how does your theory relate to the discussions about inequality that are coming from the PKT side, that actually the globalization and the development of modern capitalist institutions, etc., are the ones responsible for rising inequalities, etc., and have sort of almost an opposite or prescription to what you're suggesting in some way. So how can you square these differences? And another kind of broad minding is that we last semester we had Greg Clark, and he uses also these very deep, geography-based cultural evolutions, etc. But he comes out with a very pessimistic prescription that policy is completely ineffective in combating all these genetic diversity, etc. And so I'd like if you can relate to these two questions.
Absolutely. So naturally, when we think about inequality, we should distinguish between inequality within societies and inequality across societies. And naturally, the journey of humanity, my book, is focusing on inequality across societies rather than within societies. So naturally, when we think about globalization has a direct impact on the return of individuals within societies, and some of the inequality that we see within societies is associated with it. But of course, globalization can affect inequality across societies too. And in fact, there is an important segment of the book that is dealing precisely with these issues. But broadly speaking, as I said, this is an attempt to understand inequality across societies. This is an attempt to argue that if you look at inequality across societies only 200 years ago, inequality is relatively negligible. And much of the inequality is emerging in the past 200 years. And consequently, if we want to understand the roots of inequality as we see it today, we need to step back 200 years in human history and to ask ourselves, what happened in this singular point that caused societies to behave like galaxies drifting apart from one another, rather than societies in the solar model that are supposed to converge to one another? And as I said, my conclusion is that when you think about this singular point is affected by a lot of factors that are occurring earlier. And the way that the book is structured is such that I'm trying to remove gradually different layers of influence. So I start with colonialism and globalization, I move into institutions, then into culture, then into geography that takes us 12,000 years back, and then to human diversity. I should emphasize, when I refer to human diversity, it's any level of diversity, cultural diversity, phenotypic diversity, etc. And so this is basically the way that I look at the world. Naturally, there are a lot of forces that are affecting inequality within nations, and this is not the scope of the book.
Okay, so we have a few. Okay, you answered the one question about how do you define diversity. So that's pretty obvious. You said you were. So
let me just emphasize it, because that's very important in the context of diversity. So there is a great amount of confusion about my earlier paper on the out of Africa hypothesis. But naturally, since as economists, we would like to assure that we have proper identification, we use a particular methodology, which is the out of Africa migration, to predict diversity across the globe. The diversity that we predicted is not genetic diversity. The diversity that was predicted is an overall level of diversity. The migration out of Africa generated this compression in the diversity in any possible traits, whether it's height or weight or cultural diversity of any type, etc. And consequently, the prediction here is that diversity is critical. And therefore, it can be mitigated in the sense that naturally education that is geared towards fostering diversity in places that are missing this, and education that is fostering tolerance and respect for the difference in a place that is overly diverse or largely diverse, can mitigate this as well.
Okay, so thank you for clarifying this. So Simone Weg is asking, of complimenting you about your talk, fascinating talk, but she's asking whether you think that economists should play a bigger role in terms of the panel on the IPPC, the panel on climate change, and what, is anything from your book can be used to affect this the IPPC for if the second part of the sixth report that's coming out in 2022.
Sorry, there was a disruption and I could not properly hear the question. Can you repeat? I didn't hear who asked the question, and I couldn't fully understand the question. Sorry.
Okay, so the question is, do you think economists should play a more significant role in climate policy discussions, and how does your book inform on this?
Absolutely. So I think that when we think about climate change and we think about pollution in general, it is individuals that are polluting. And we know that the current climatic crisis is originated at the time of industrialization. We understand the catalyst, but at the same time, we understand that this process of industrialization and acceleration in technological progress is generating an additional effect, which is basically a gradual decline in fertility. Only recently, it was announced that even India, it has population growth that is just touching replacement now. But we see this trend, namely we see that the number of souls that are polluting planet Earth is gradually declining. And consequently, it appears that the pressure that is coming from the number of individuals, so the growth in the number of individuals, will decline in the centuries to come, and this will provide scientists provide scientists with the time that will permit them to develop this revolutionary technology. So in some sense, I mean, it's perhaps ironic that this acceleration in technological progress is generating pollution, but at the same time, is generating fertility decline and the power of innovations that can rescue the planet from this catastrophe. So it is very important that economists will be involved, because I think that the demographic aspect is very, very critical. So for instance, in one study that I published on the subject, I showed that the elasticity of pollution with respect to income per capita is 1/7 than the elasticity of pollution with respect to the number of people. Namely, if you reduce the number of people, you can have the compatibility of economic growth and the decline in carbon emission. Now, this will not reverse the process, but as I said, it can buy us the essential time to a few more decades to develop these revolutionary technologies that will be necessary in order to ultimately reverse the current trend.
Thank you. So I think we ran up to the formal time. So it's 6 o'clock now in Geneva, and we move to the less formal part. So I'd like to thank you, Oded, again for this fascinating presentation. I learned a lot, and let's move. So with this, we end and move on to the second part. And so we have another 15 minutes, and there are a few more people in the Q&A that want to ask questions. So let's see if I can unmute Gabriel. Gabriel, I unmuted you, so you can ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
We can hear you.
Oh, hi. Well, thank you so much for the talk. It's a really wonderful, really wide-ranging overview of basically all of recorded human history. So I had the impression, potentially, that's incorrect, correct me if that's necessary, that you're sort of putting geography in the driving seat and potentially distance from Africa as like the exogenous variables in your account, and then noting that, culture and institutions are, as I think we all agree, endogenous. But over the very, very long term, I mean, people are picking their environments through moving around. And of course, we've altered our environments very, very substantially, land clearing, soil quality, et cetera. So I was wondering if you could comment on why you think of these bits of the story as the exogenous bits and the other bits as the more endogenous bits, as opposed to, say, people's beliefs or cultures or institutions driving them to pick where they live and alter where they live in particular ways. Thanks.
Thank you. So as you suggested correctly, the way that I present the thesis is such that, yes, there are some critical junctures in which institutions can emerge randomly and can generate the divide that we see across some societies. And there are some critical junctures in which we can see the emergence of cultural mutations that can generate some divide. But to a large extent, these processes are not manna from heaven. They are a byproduct of certain processes that are occurring in the course of human history. So when we think about exogenous sources of variations, naturally, the first one that comes to mind is geography. And this takes us into, as I said earlier, the disease environment, isolations, etc. And it takes us back 12,000 years ago to the onset of the Neolithic Revolution. And it takes us as early as 60,000 years ago to the time in which humans are migrating out of Africa in an attempt to alleviate population pressure and to find greater fertile lands as they move forward. Now, if we think about the exogeneity, and if you're referring to the exogeneity in the context of human migration, at least my studies suggest that the migration is orthogonal to a selection process. Surprised me quite a bit, but it appears that this migration is occurring in a way that there is population pressure, but people that are migrating out of Africa are not necessarily different than the representative population in Africa. And this suggests that somehow that this is indeed an exogenous event in which migration is taking place, people are populating the world, and consequently, the distribution of diversity is being affected. And as I said, it affects comparative development. But if you think about, say, the post-1500 migration, naturally there is a great reshuffling of the human population. And much of what I do in my paper with Q and Out of Africa is try to correct for this and basically try to develop a measure that is respectful of the ancestral composition of the population. So in this respect, I think that we can comfortably rest on the idea that the migratory distance from Africa, is an exogenous force, and this migratory distance from Africa can be weighted properly based on the ancestral compositions of different populations so as to account for the impact of this process. So when we think about exogeneity, geography to a large extent is exogenous, but again, human interaction with the geographical environment does have an effect. And the migration out of Africa to a large extent is exogenous, but again, there are certain processes that are affecting the degree of diversity, and as a result of it, it's not necessarily purely exogenous, although one can use different strategies so as to instrument and to assure that, in fact, one can look at exogenous sources of variations in the impact of the out of Africa hypothesis on comparative development. But as I said, what is striking for me is to see the magnitudes, because if you look at the magnitudes of, as I said, executive constraint democracies, variables that were considered very strongly, versus the out of Africa hypothesis versus geography, it appears that in fact the deeper roots are capturing much of the variations across the globe. Thank you.
So I have Ugo here. I don't know if it was a comment or a question. So if you're Ugo, if you have a question, I'm muting you. If not, I'll switch to the next.
It was a question that I was typing, then the time was over, so I stopped typing. But if I can ask it, I'll ask it. It's kind of I don't know if it's a provocative question. So, well, first of all, it was a great presentation. I'm really looking forward to reading the book.
Okay.
The provocative question was this one. Let's suppose that I'm a person that I'm designing immigration policy in a country, and my sole objective is to maximize the benefits out of diversity. So your book says that basically I should promote migration if I'm in the left-hand side of the distribution, and basically clearly opposite if I'm on the right-hand side, and I don't know if I'm in the peak. Is this a right interpretation?
Well, so again, so if you think about, so what I show is that diversity is very important. What I show is that the lack of diversity can be mitigated by policies that will foster cultural diversity in homogeneous societies and will mitigate sort of non-tolerance in diverse societies. But at the same time, migration is a little bit tricky in the sense that when we think about migration and the time that migrants take to fully assimilate, and it's a lengthy process. And so the question is, what is our horizon? What is the discount factor? But broadly speaking, yes. And in fact, I'm working on this subject, which is what is in fact the optimal migratory pattern. Suppose that you are an individual somewhere in Bolivia. Where would you like to migrate to? Into a diverse society, a homogeneous society, where your productivity will complement the existing productivity in society in an optimal fashion. In fact, I have at the moment a research project that is basically trying to understand the future of humanity in the next 200 years. And part of what is being done there is an attempt to understand how, for instance, displacement due to climatic change, or the fact that borders will not be able to be protected in the future due to the development of personal technology that will allow you to overcome the barriers, how this will affect the degree of diversity, the homogenization of planet Earth, and what type of migratory patterns we will be able to see. So these are fascinating issues, but I'm just at the beginning of exploring these patterns.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have Mariella. I don't know if she's online. Let me check and unmute her. No, I guess she dropped out. Marie Biegelman, you're next.
Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Couldn't unmute myself. Yeah. Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting. So I'm sorry if my question is a bit, I'm not really from that field, so if it sounds stupid, but I understand the importance of the deep-rooted factors that you proposed in both, well, the differences in growth and in inequality across countries. So I was wondering what we could make of the role of domination of societies on others. So I don't know, I'm thinking of slavery, colonization, this domination itself depends on those deep-rooted factors, of course. But I was wondering whether, we could also consider that some of those dominations could, have occurred for some exogenous factors, and how those past dominations, like how much of this history can actually explain these differences in growth and inequality between countries today.
Right. So thank you very much. So this is an interesting question, and in some sense, it's really at the heart of the thesis that was advanced by Jared Diamond. So he argued that, in fact, variations in the timing of the Neolithic Revolution led into what he calls guns, germs, and steel. Namely, they equipped Europeans with the guns, with the steel, and the germs that allowed them to colonize the world and to ultimately dominate other societies. And as I said, if I look at the this particular thesis, I think that it's a very good explanation for what we see in the world in about the year 1500. And it's certainly an important factor in understanding the pattern of colonization later on. But as I said, if you look at the persistent effect of this, it doesn't appear to persist because naturally the Neolithic revolution is a mixed bag. On the one hand, it gives you a technological head start, which is very beneficial in the context of development. But on the other hand, it is associated with comparative advantage in agriculture that is not necessarily beneficial as we move into a more elaborate world in which the demand for human capital is much larger in the industrial sector. So because of this mixed bag, despite the fact that early transition to agriculture is permitting some societies to dominate others, it doesn't really persist over time. So if we think about certainly variations across the globe, they're not mapped into the transition into the Neolithic. But if we think about continents, Eurasia versus the Americas, I think that the explanation of Diamond is quite potent here in explaining the pattern of domination that we see in the world at this particular juncture. And naturally, this is reinforced by institutions and globalization and imposed trade. And it really interacts nicely with the broad theory that I advance, unified growth theory, namely, think about trade patterns between developed and less developed societies. And these trade patterns implies that some societies are specializing in industrial, human capital intensive goods. Other societies are specializing in agriculture, low human capital intensive goods. And as a result of it, if you think about the process that I describe in unified growth theory, and I describe in the first part of today's lecture, this implies that the transition from stagnation to growth is expedited in one segment of the world, and the transition in other segments of the world is being delayed. And as a result of it, a huge divergence is taking place because of these forces. So naturally, this is central, and it is in fact central in the way that I peel gradually the layers of influence on comparative development today.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you. We're coming to the end, so I'll try to be brief. I also wanted to query you about your optimistic view of the future, because there's a very well-known literature on the decline on productivity growth and how would that fit with you. But let me focus on something different. Migration has been asked at least twice already, so let me go back to it. So if I understood it at the end, your policy recommendations would favor integration in more homogeneous societies, and perhaps as a preamble to opening up the borders to more diverse migrants. But wouldn't actually that increase the variation in diversity across nations? Because we know that immigrants tend to go to countries where they expect to have a better economic life and so on. So wouldn't opening up the borders actually concentrate the advantages that rich countries already have and make them even more burdening relative to the rest of the world? Thank you.
Right. So I want to be careful here about the policy prescriptions that I refer to. So when I refer to policies that are associated with diversity, I refer to policies that are implemented within an economy rather than in the global world. So as I said, if I think about a country like Bolivia that lacks diversity, then again, in this type of society, I would like to develop an education curriculum that will basically foster pluralism, that will foster thinking out of the box, that will allow basically people to mitigate the degree of homogeneity in this society. If I think about the other end of the spectrum, Ethiopia, and there, the society is very diverse. And I see civil conflicts at the moment and before. And naturally there, I would like, again, the education system not only to be focusing on individuals completing 6 years of education or 12 years of education, but I would like the curriculum to be targeting precisely the issue of tolerance and social non-cohesiveness, because this appears critical in this type of societies. So, as I said, the policies that I refer to were policies that are relevant to what we see within an economy. I don't have very clear view about migration policy, because naturally, as I said before, this involves certain interaction across societies. It involves certain short-term frictions that will affect certain populations based on their long-term orientation. It depends very much on how you discount the future. But regardless of how you discount the future, if you adopt these critical elements that I mentioned, tolerance, cohesiveness, pluralism, etc., that's a key to human prosperity. I should mention, in addition, that there are other elements that are important here, which are the growth-enhancing cultural traits. The book is basically emphasizing the fact that in some societies, because of geographical characteristics, there is not enough emphasis on future-oriented outlook. And this can, again, be mitigated by proper education policy. Or we know that certain geographical elements are affecting gender equality or gender biases. And again, this can be mitigated. And so if we think about the key to human prosperity, as I said, I view it as gender equality and its impact on fertility and the environment, social cohesiveness and tolerance, and pluralism in the context of diversity, and future-oriented mindset that is critical to assure that, in fact, societies are progressing as rapidly as they can.
Thanks. It's hard to disagree. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. We have ran out of time, or slightly exceeded our time, but we had a small technical glitch, so I think we can tolerate that. So I'd like to thank Oded again for a fascinating presentation, a very lively and interesting Q&A, and remind our viewers that we next week will have a seminar on the short and long run effects of affirmative action evidence from imperial China. So I wish you all a pleasant evening, pleasant afternoon, morning, wherever you are, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.